Hello and welcome back to this video series where we're looking at building an e-commerce platform in 25 days using Next, Netlify, and Stripe. In this video, we're going to look at building a shopping cart. So shopping carts are pretty common in e-commerce, obviously. It's the ability to add something to a shopping cart. So if I wanted to buy this Red Dead Redemption 2 game, I can add this to my cart, and then I can keep shopping and continue adding things to my cart, and then when I'm actually ready to purchase these items, I can proceed to the checkout and go through the payment flow. So we're going to build the ability to remember these products and add them to a cart and kind of build up this collection of things that we want to buy before we head to the checkout. So we're going to need some kind of way to remember the items that are in our cart. And so we're going to need some kind of state somewhere. So for this, we're going to build our own custom hook that we'll be able to use across different components. So I'm going to create a new folder for hooks. And inside this hooks folder, a new file called usecart.js. And now I'm just going to build this out the same way that we would any other component in React. So one difference being here that the U is lowercase, whereas if this was a regular React component, that would be capitalized. And also from our hook, we can return anything we want. So we don't need to just return some markup that says something. We could return an object from here. And inside this object, we could have like a cart that's equal to an empty array. So now if we wanted to consume this hook in one of our other components, like if we went over to our index.js page, we could import this just like any other component. And then call it from within our component the same way we have other hooks. And then this is going to give us back whatever we returned from that hook. So this was an object that had cart in it. So we could destructure off our cart, and then we could just console log out what our cart is set to, and head over to our application, open up our console, and you'll see that we've got this empty array. And then if we went back to our hook and we set this to an array with the string hello in it, that's what we'll see in the console in our component. Okay, cool. So if we want to keep a dynamic cart of items, we probably want to keep that somewhere. So we're going to bring in useState from React, and then we are going to call useState, give it an empty array to begin with. So that's our cart's going to be empty to begin with, and that's going to give us back a cart and a function to set our cart. So if we were to just remove that value there, then we will be returning this cart from our hook, which means we now have this dynamic value that we can update. So we can add items to the cart, we can remove items. And because that's the variable that we're passing out to any component that's using it, this is sort of like subscribing to changes on that variable. So anytime we call set cart within our hook, it's automatically going to update any components that are using that. Okay, so now we probably want a way to actually add an item to the cart. So we can declare a new function. And then as parameters, this can take in an ID, so we know which product we're trying to add. And we can also take in a quantity. So we could call this function to add 5 of the basketball hoop, for example, to our cart. And then just to make this function a little bit nicer to use for all of our components, we're just going to set a default value of quantity to 1. So if we call this function from one of our components and just pass in an ID, so if we just said add item to cart and we passed in ID 52, for example, then this is going to call this function and quantity is automatically going to be set to 1. So we're just going to add 1 of the item number 52 to our cart. But if we were to pass a second parameter, so if we were to say, oh, we want to add 3 of this item to the cart, then quantity will be set to the value 3. And so we'll add the item 52 to the cart and the quantity 3. Okay, so we can just call set cart. and then that's going to take an array, so a new version of our cart. And in that, we want to spread in the current values of our cart. So we want to take any values that we currently have in our cart, and we want to spread them into a new array. And then we also want to add to that array a new object with that ID and quantity. So our cart is going to be made up of a collection of objects, and then in each of those objects, we're going to have the ID of the product that we want to have in our cart, and then the number of that product that we want to buy. Okay, so the next thing we probably want is the ability to remove an item from the cart. And again, for that, we're going to take in an ID. And then we want to construct a new cart. And so that is going to be equal to our current cart. So the current items in our cart array. We then want to filter those items. So filter is another similar function to map or for each. It's going to iterate over all of the items in our cart or in our array. And it's going to call our callback on each of those items. So map is always going to give us back an array of the same size that's going to contain whatever we return from inside our callback. But filter is a little bit different in that we use it to filter out values. And so the array that we return could be much smaller. So it's going to iterate over each item in the array. And then if we were to essentially return an expression that evaluates to true, then it's going to be in that collection. So that it's going to be in the new array. And if we were to return false, then it's not going to be in the array. So if we're iterating over every item in the collection, what we want to do is return whether that item's ID does not equal the ID that we've passed in. So this expression is going to evaluate to false for every item in our cart currently, except for that ID that we've passed in. And so what we get here with our new cart is all of our items from the cart except for the one that we want to remove. So then we can just call setCart and pass in our new cart. Okay, cool. So now we just need to share this add item to cart function and this remove item from cart function to anything that wants to consume our hook. So here, instead of just returning the cart, we can also return add item to cart, and we can return remove item from cart. Okay, so now if we wanted to add an item to the cart from that component that's consuming that hook, here where we're destructuring off our cart, we can also destructure off our add item to cart function. So now if we call this function with an ID or an ID and a quantity, then that is going to be added to this cart in our hook. Okay, so looking at our application, we're going to want to add a button for each one of these products where we can click that button and add it to the cart. Okay, cool. So back over in our index.js, this is our render product function. So our cart should actually be down in our main component. So I'm just going to cut these two lines here, move them down to our homepage and put them there. Okay, cool. So now I want to pass my add item to cart function into render product. So we're going to have to refactor this just a little bit so we can pass that function in. So we're mapping over each product here. And then for each product, we want to call render product and pass in that product. And now we also want to pass in the add item to cart function. And now if I scroll up to our render product function, that now takes our our product and also our add item to cart function. Cool, so now if I add a button here, it says add to cart. And then anytime we click that button, so I want to add an on-click handler here. And then in here, we are going to declare an arrow function. So this is what it's going to call when our button is actually clicked. And from here, we're going to call add item to cart. And now we don't actually have an ID to give it because our products don't have an ID at the moment. So we need something unique. So I'm just going to use this slug for now. So product.slug. but we are going to need to refactor our markdown files so that they contain some kind of ID or SKU or something to keep a unique identifier for each of our different products. But let's just make sure this is working by passing it our product slug. Okay, so if I open up my console and click add to cart, we see this array here, and we've got an item in there. So we've got /product/cooking classes, and the quantity is 1. So that looks like that has worked correctly. It's taken us to the details page because we've told this entire button to be a link. So anytime we click anything inside there, it's going to take us to this page. So what happens in JavaScript land is if we have this button, which is inside this whole link, when we click this button, it's going to trigger the onClick event for this button, but then it's going to propagate that event to all of its parents. So it's going to keep going up the chain and saying, do you have an onClick handler? Do you have an onClick handler? Do you have an onClick handler? And it's going to get to the link, or the A tag, which is wrapping our entire card here, and then that has a href on it. And so when we click the button, it's triggering the onClick for that button, but then it's going all the way up the chain to the anchor tag at the top, and it's also navigating to that href. So we just need to tell our button, hey, once you have triggered your onClick handler, don't propagate this event to any of your parents. You keep it secret. It'll be our own little secret. We'll keep it quiet. Don't tell any of the parents. And so in order to do that, over here where we have our button and our onClick handler, rather than being an inline arrow function, I'm just going to declare a new function up here called handleClick. So this event here is passed in automatically by JavaScript anytime we click a button or anytime an event is triggered. And so we're going to take that add item to cart function call, and we're going to do that from within our handleClick function. So we need to actually call this handleClick when our button is clicked. And we don't put the open close brackets on the end here because we're passing a reference to this whole function. So this is kind of replacing our arrow function that we had down here. And so the browser will call this function when the button is actually clicked. Okay, so the last thing we need to do here is just say on that event, we want to call a prevent propagation function, which is going to stop that event bubbling up through all of the different parents. So now if we come back here and click add to cart, and once again, the error is correct. I'm not smarter than the computers. They're smarter than me. It's not prevent propagation, it's stop propagation. Okay, so now if we head back to our landing page, let's just get rid of all that scary stuff there and click add to cart, and it adds it into our cart, and we click another one, and we've got 2 objects in our cart, and then we've got 3 objects and 4 objects, and if we open up that cart, we can see that we've got our separate IDs for each of those and our quantities. Okay, sick. So we've got our cart working correctly. We just need to fix up this ID part here. So I'm going to go back to our project, and inside each of our markdown files, I'm going to add an ID to the front matter. So I'm just going to give the ID 1 to this first one, and then 2, 3, 4, 5. But you can make this much more creative if you want. It just needs to be something unique. Okay, cool. And now back in our index.js file, if we have a look at get static props, we don't actually need to change anything here because we've been pulling out all of our front matter and then spreading that into our product and doing something similar in our product.js file. So this should actually feed all the way through to our component automatically. So let's just console log out what our component looks like here. What our product looks like. We have an error. That might actually be related to something else. And if we scroll up a little bit further, we've got our objects with our different IDs. And so I think this is actually complaining at us that each child within our list should have a unique key prop. And I'm assuming that's because our link doesn't have a key on it. So we're just going to set our key to our new product.id because we know that that is going to be unique. And that, hopefully, if I get rid of this and refresh, we shouldn't see that big ugly error. Okay, cool. So now that we have our IDs making it all the way to our products, that's what we can use in our add item to cart function. So rather than being product.slug here, we're going to do product.id. And then if we get rid of this console log here and refresh our page, we should see that empty array. And then as we add items to the cart, we should see their ID and their quantity. And so if we add this one, it should be ID 1 with a quantity of 1. Awesome. But there's a couple of other bugs here that I wanted to work through. So one of them is that if we add the same item to the cart again, you'll see that it's got 3 items. And so ID 1 has actually been added to the cart twice. And so this probably isn't the expected behavior for our customers. They probably expect that if they click add to cart again with the same item that's already in the cart, it's just going to add 1 to the quantity. So let's implement that. So back in our use cart hook, where we're adding the item to the cart, we can add a little bit more logic here to say if the item is already in the cart, then we just want to increment the quantity by 1. So the first thing we need to do is check whether that item is currently in the cart. So we can say cart.find, which again is another method that iterates over the entire collection, so similar to filter and map and all of those other ones. So we're iterating over each of our items, and then if our item .id is equal to that ID that we've passed in. So item here is either going to be set to that item that we found within the cart, or it's going to be set to null. So we can do a check to say, well, if we did find an item there, then we want to increase quantity. And otherwise, if we didn't find that item, then we just want to do this part. So we just want to set the cart to being that new ID with that new quantity. So then to increase the quantity, we can just say, well, the items.quantity field, we just want to plus equal whatever quantity we've passed in. Because remember, we could be passing in like 5, and we might already have 1 in the cart. And so we would want to add 5 to the existing 1. So it's equal to 6. And then to trigger that something has actually changed in the cart, we call setCart, and we pass it a new array, but we're just going to spread in the values of the cart currently. So this will just trigger off a re-render and tell anything that's subscribed to this cart that something has changed. Okay, cool. So now if we head back to the browser and refresh, we should see an empty array. And then if we add this one in, we get an item in that array. And then if we add this one, we get a second item because that's a different product. But then if we add this first one again, we should see that there's still only 2 items in our cart. But if we expand this out, ID 1 has a quantity of 2 now because we clicked it twice. And if we click it again, we'll see that ID 1 has a quantity of 3. Awesome, so that's working correctly. So the last, I guess, kind of bug that I wanted to fix in this video is now we've got this cart that we're building up, but now if we go and look at this basketball hoop page and we come back to our index, you'll see that our cart is empty again. And that's because when we navigate away from our index page, all of the components on that page are destroyed. And so all of the use state values are forgotten. And then when we go back there in our use cart hook, it's calling use state again and passing it an empty array. And so those old cart values are being forgotten. So if we want to remember those values, then we need to save them somewhere. Thankfully, the browser has this awesome API called localStorage, and we can call set item and add some kind of data to localStorage that then we can access with localStorage.getItem. So if we were to set an item for cart to be whatever the state of our cart is, sorry, things keep popping up in the way. If we were to set the key cart to be the state of our cart, then we could go and get the item cart and store that into some kind of new cart variable. So it just gives us a way to kind of store something, keep some kind of persistent data in the browser. Okay, so when do we actually want to write to localStorage? Well, we know that anytime this cart changes, so anytime we add an item to the cart or we remove an item from the cart, we probably want to save that state to localStorage. So we kind of want to synchronize some kind of side effect to our cart changing. See, you're just too good. Use effect is exactly what we need for that, isn't it? And so in here is where we are going to write to local storage. And then the dependency that we want to listen to changes on is cart. So anytime cart changes, we want to go and write these to local storage again. So we can do that by saying localStorage.setItem, and then we're going to give it a key, which is the string cart. So the key needs to be a string, but the value also needs to be a string. So we can't actually just give it the state of our cart because that's a JSON object that has different key value pairs. But what we can do is we can say we want to stringify our cart. So by calling JSON all caps .stringify, this is going to take a JSON object and it's going to turn it into a big string representation of that object. So this is also referred to as serializing something. So anytime our cart changes, we're going to call localStorage.setItem, and then we're going to set the key cart to be the stringified version of our cart object. Okay, so now when we initialize our cart, rather than being an empty array, we probably want to go and read the value from local storage to find out if we already have a cart. So I'm going to create this new function called getInitialCart, which is going to read from local storage. So we're going to do getItem, and we're going to get the item cart. And now this is going to return us that string value. So the string representation of our cart, because that's what we saved in local storage. And so we just need to say json.parse. So that's going to be the opposite of json.stringify. So it's going to take a stringified or a string representation of a JSON object and turn it into a JSON object. And so now we can call that inside our use state here. So we want to get the initial cart. But this is going to cause an error. So this is saying local storage is not defined, and this error happened while generating the page. So the problem here is that when the page gets generated, it happens on the server side. And so local storage exists in our browser, but it doesn't exist on the server. So here we're just calling getInitialCart, and that's assuming that we're running on the client side. But the first time this renders, we're over on the server. So when we set our cart to be this initial cart, we need to make sure that we're running in the client. So one way we can do that is we can use useEffect again and give it an empty dependency array. So useEffect will only ever get triggered on the client side. Like this will only ever happen after the component has been mounted in the browser. So this is a little bit of a trick that we can use to get around that first render being on the server side with next.js. So then we want to set this back to an empty array. And then inside here, we want to go and get our initial cart. So that's going to be equal to calling getInitialCart. And then we want to check if we actually have an initial cart. Oh, sorry, I left an I off there. We want to check whether we actually have an initial cart, because remember, this is going to go off to local storage, but the first time our users come to this page, if they've never added anything to their cart, then they don't have anything in local storage, so they just want that empty array to begin with. So here we're just checking if they have previously set something in their cart. So if we have a value in local storage for that cart, then we want to set the cart to being our initial cart. Okay, cool. So that looks like it's rendering correctly. And if we add these different things to our cart, we can add a few turntables. And now if we have a look at our cart, we should see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we've got a mix of 1s and 6s and 8s. And then if we refresh our application and look at that last version, we have those same values. And then we refresh again, and we have those same values, and we navigate to one of these pages, and we come back, and we've still got the same values. Awesome. So we've built a persistent cart that we can use to save each of the items that the user wants to purchase. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can share this cart across multiple components by using something called React Context. I'll see you there.